Hey guys, what's up? So welcome to this new ASP.NET Core tutorial series, and we're going to be using the latest version of .NET Core, which as of the time of this video is 2.1. And in order to be able to proceed with this tutorial, you definitely need to make sure that you download that and have it installed. And if you're on Windows, you might as well have the .NET framework there as well in case you guys decide to not use .NET Core for whatever sort of project you're using. The tutorial that we're going to be covering here is going to apply to both .NET Core as well as the .NET framework, the latest version. There are going to be certain features of each one that may not be 100% compatible, but ultimately most of the material that we'll cover is going to work in both versions. So specifically what we're going to be looking at is the .NET runtime is Microsoft's runtime that runs on its operating system. So the .NET framework runs on a Microsoft operating system. .NET Core is actually able to be run cross-platform. So it's not just for Microsoft operating systems. It can also be used for Mac and Linux. So in addition to that, there is a language which is C#, and that's the language we're going to be focusing on in this tutorial. And that is Microsoft's flagship language that they've used for the last probably 18 years now, I guess. And that is a language that was much inspired by the Java language. It's a fully object-oriented language, and we're going to be looking at that in this tutorial series. And then specifically for the C# language, there is the ASP.NET web framework, which is Microsoft's most popular web framework, and the latest version is ASP.NET Core. So I've been writing C# and specifically ASP.NET websites for roughly 8 years or so, on and off. I do a lot of JavaScript and front-end UI work, but as you'll see in here, ASP.NET consists of a lot of C# code. Now you can use Visual Basic or VB.NET if you wanted to. But most people that are doing anything with Microsoft these days are going to be using C# for anything new. And that's just my recommendation, that if you're going to be choosing between VB.NET or C#, I would definitely choose C#. So the final thing that you'll need that I recommend is an editor. You need some sort of development environment. Now you can use Visual Studio Code if you want to, but this tutorial series is going to be using the free version of Visual Studio 2017. There's a community, you can see free download right there. So I'll have both of these links in the description tab, so make sure you have both of them installed. So after you have it installed, go ahead and launch Visual Studio 2017. When you launch the application, you should be greeted with a screen that looks like this. And this can be a very daunting application if you've never used it before. But the good news is it's like Photoshop. Like, it's very complicated. It can do amazing things, but you're not going to use like half the features for a very long time, if ever. So don't let that get to you. But let's go ahead and just jump right into this. We're going to go ahead and create our new project here. So we're going to go to File, a New Project. Inside of here, you should be greeted with something more or less similar to this. You may have less, depending on your install. It doesn't really matter. But you will have this Visual C# with the web selection. So if you have that selected, you're going to see that you can create two different websites using ASP.NET. There's the .NET Core that I talked about in the previous video, and then there's the .NET typical framework for Microsoft operating systems. This video tutorial is all about .NET Core, which is cross-platform, so that's what we want to use. Also, I have a tutorials .NET Core folder that I'm going to be putting my application into. I'm just going to call this first application so that I can easily tell the difference as we go through samples. And this first application here, let's go ahead and we're going to put that into the .NET Core. You can have these two options selected if you wanted to. But this is all beyond the scope of this tutorial here, as far as Git repositories and things like that, so we're not going to worry about that. Let's go ahead and click OK. Now this is going to go ahead and create a bunch of scaffolding once we select what type of application we want. So we're greeted with all this information here, and this is a lot of information. We're going to start with just an empty, but what I want you to pay attention to is make sure you have the .NET Core framework selected and the latest version. So you can see I have multiple versions there that I can choose from. Don't worry about Docker. We're not going to worry about Docker in this. You might as well have configure HTTPS in there in case you do try to go live with your website and you need encryption. And then as far as the authentication, we're not going to worry about that right now. So just go ahead and click OK. This will have a bunch of standard like startup code that Microsoft will give you out of the box that's going to run an actual working website. And in the next video, we will talk about the actual structure of the code. Hey guys, what's up? So in this video, we're going to be looking at the overall structure of a .NET application for .NET Core, ASP.NET. And the first thing is the application actually starts up with the program file. This is actually the main startup point, the main portion of your application. And you can see here that this is the main function. You can pass in some string arguments to your actual web server. Then it calls this actual method that's defined inside of here that implements a web host builder interface, and by doing that it has some built-in web server defaults. This is using something called the Kestrel web server, which is a new Microsoft project that comes with this. So it's different from IIS, but it is a cross-platform internet web server that is created by the Microsoft. So it ships by default. So that's actually what we're using here, since we want to use .NET Core. And from there, though, this project is also going to have a startup file. So this startup file, everything that goes through your application, so every request that is made to your server is going to go through this configure method, and it's going to fire one time for every request that comes through. So the application by default is actually it's responding to, for every request, it's responding back with just a standard string response of hello world. So if we go ahead and run the application, we can go ahead and run our working code by pressing this play button. This is going to fire up a localhost web server using IIS Express and Kestrel. And really that's confusing because nobody's calling it Kestrel really. I mean, everybody's called it IIS Express. I mean, that's what we call the IIS web server that's built into Visual Studio when we're debugging and everything. But I guess eventually we're going to start calling it the Kestrel web server. So as you can see, this localhost is it's our localhost port. It stands for, it signifies 127.0.0.1, and then the colon and everything after that is actually the port number that this web server is listening for or listening to, and all requests to this port are being returned with a response of hello world. We're gonna have to change that functionality obviously to be able to have a much more robust website, and we're gonna do that in the following videos. But what I do want to show you guys real quick is the configurations of where that magic's happening. If you went ahead and you looked inside of the, if you right click on the actual project itself and click on the properties, this is going to give you a bunch of properties for your application. It tells you everything from how the project is building, what sort of dependencies it has. You can see its target framework is .NET 2.1. So if you guys wanted to adjust the port number that it's listening to, you would go under the properties and there's a launch settings.json file. And then inside of here, you can actually see that the actual port number is being set right there. So you can change that to whatever you want. Here's the main application URL. And then there's just a bunch of different information in here. You can see the actual .NET Core, and we're not going to get into it right now, but you can actually have subsettings under your launch settings for different environments. So it makes it easy to kind of say, okay, if I'm under the dev environment, then use this JSON launch setting. If I'm in production, I'm going to use this one. You know what I mean? So you can have a lot of things like your connection strings, things like that are stored inside of these actual physical files that can be secured away on a server somewhere instead of like in a database. And then the www root folder, that is again the static root that we're going to see in a future video here, but that's where all of our CSS and JavaScript and things like that is going to go. If you wanted to adjust the web config or have like system config variables, like if you've ever seen Django development, there's a settings file, which is essentially where a lot of the application's main settings are stored. And that's going to still be under a web config, but it's a little confusing because by default this isn't shown. If you say show all files, that still doesn't show it, which is interesting. But if you right click on the actual project, you're going to be able to see that you can edit then the sysproj file of your application. And the sysproj file is actually going to be, it's going to have all of your dependencies inside of here. This is it's just going to the main dependency right here at the moment, but the main dependency has a ton of other sub-dependencies. But eventually when you start adding new NuGet packages to your application, you're going to see all that stuff inside of your sysproj file. So that's really the overall structure of the application itself. Just again, the web server is spun up here when the main application is started. It's going to have some built-in functionality for you that you're going to need. It's going to call this startup for every request that's made. When the application is run, it doesn't matter whatever happens. You're going to see that this hello world is just simply returned. So in this video, what we want to do is make our app a little bit more practical by tapping into this static root folder that we have. And the way this works is that the Kestrel web server, for every request that's made, it goes to this configure. So any middleware and everything is all going to, the request and response and all that stuff is all going to be processed through here. And the thing is, though, is that if the web server encounters a request to some sort of content that matches the root folder, then it's going to serve that up first. And if it doesn't find any sort of match, then it's going to go ahead and pass that request on to our actual server, server-side code for further handling via .NET Core. So obviously there's more processing power and processing overhead and things like that for .NET Core, specifically ASP.NET Core, the code to process the request. So if the server doesn't need to pass that on, for something like a CSS file or an image file or something like that, then it's not going to do that. So it makes the server much more efficient. Another thing too is static content can actually be delivered in a much more efficient manner as well, like especially with HTTP2 and some of the other advances that have been made over the past few years. So in order to see how this works is what we want to do is get rid of this app.run because it's always just returning the same response to hello world. And what I want to do is say app.use something called static file. So if we ever wanted to set up things like CORS headers, if you guys are familiar with that, then you would end up doing all that here, and you can actually set up custom functionality for all that stuff. And in case you guys don't know, CORS headers allows one server to get a request from another server, which is typically prevented by default for security purposes. Anyway, so let's go ahead and move this. So now that we're using the static files, basically the server is going to look inside of here for any sort of matches. So let's go ahead and create a new item. And inside of here, we're going to create just a standard HTML file. So let's see, where is that at? There it is, HTML page. And we're just going to call this index.html. All right, so inside of here, let's go ahead and change the message. And we'll say hello from your mom. Okay, all right, so now that we have that, if we go ahead and run the application, because we've enabled the static content, the web server is now going to look inside of that static folder for any sort of request that matches. So index.html clearly matches, the web server responds, and we get our message. Now, if we want to get a little bit more robust in here as well, let's go ahead and add a few more folders. We're going to add CSS, I'm not even going to do all. For now, let's just do a CSS file just to give you guys an example. So let's create a new item, and inside of here, this is going to be a style sheet. So we're going to say main.css. All right, so here we go. There's the body. Let's take this out, and since we have an H1, we're going to go ahead and add an H1 style, and we'll say color is red. And then inside of our index.html, if I went ahead and I can just drag this file right into the head here, and you can see that it's going to link right out to it. So that's a very nifty feature, I think. And let's go ahead and run the application now. So we should see that our H1 is now in red if we go to index.html. And you can see that it's now in red. So we now have styling and things like that. So both of those requests were actually made and handled via the static server for the built-in Kestrel static server. And none of that request was actually processed via .NET Core. So in the next video, let's go ahead and talk about how to actually get .NET Core involved in the processing. So in the previous videos, we've been using the static web server to actually handle all of the responses. But now what we want to do is we want to actually go into getting .NET involved. So let's go ahead and do that now. And what we need to do in order for that to happen is we need to configure our routes. So what we need to do is add in an argument. So let's stop our web server, and under the static files, and this is actually important because you want static files to be you want that to be processed first before trying to process any sort of server-side route that you might have. So that way you're not trying to invoke, you're not trying to look on the server for something that doesn't exist or that doesn't need to be handled. So this is going to take a lambda function in it. So the lambda is just a shorthand function here, and Inside of here, we're going to go ahead and say routes.map route. And this is where you actually define the routes for your application. So we're going to say the name, this is just the default route. And then we're going to give it a template to use. And the template is actually how routes are matched up in the application. So the template is very important here. So this is where you actually spell out that, okay, when you make a request, I want the controller to handle that. And then I'm going to say the next thing is going to be the action. And then the last thing is going to be maybe the ID of something or the value or something. But that's typically the shorthand template syntax you normally see. Also, I have that should have a semicolon on it. All right, so anyway, what we have going on here is that this expects that, okay, for every request that I'm going to have a controller, an action, and an ID that needs to be passed in. Now, the reason why this process kind of sucks, and we'll see in just a moment here, is that it does require that an ID parameter be passed in order for this route to be matched. So one thing I want to touch upon is that .NET Core and ASP.NET is still using MVC. So MVC is the model view controller, and I know this isn't actually spelled out in the correct order of model view controller, but this is actually spelled out in the order of the request. So when a request comes into your application, it's going to be handled by the controller. The controller is going to be calling out. It's going to be able to receive the request. It's going to be able to deliver the response. It's going to be using the pipeline and the middleware and everything that I described in the previous videos. It's going to call out to different services. It's going to end up building a model that ends up getting passed into the view, and the view gets returned as a response, assuming that there is a template that you're trying to return as part of the view. Now, you could obviously have a controller endpoint that is just returning data. So it could be returning like XML or JSON data, or even just a string. But the fact of the matter, the MVC pattern is followed in .NET Core. Also, we do have a bug right here. This is a typo. This you do not need to have that extra curly brace on there. I did not mean that. So now that we've seen those three conventions with model, view, and controller, let's go ahead and create those folders in our application because we're going to need them. So we're going to create a folder called controllers, and this should be uppercase by convention. We'll create another folder for our models, and then another one for our views. And inside of our controller, let's go ahead and create our first controller. So we're going to use the default templating here. We're going to say MVC controller, and it's going to be called empty. We're going to say add. Now you might get an error message here, and I'm just curious if we do. By default, I want to have the first controller named home controller, and that is typically the default first controller. Now, depending on your setup, you may or may not have problems with the scaffolding. Hopefully you don't. And I was earlier, so if I still am, then we're just going to do it manually. But Visual Studio, okay, here we go. So we do have some decent functionality there that is working. That's cool. So it created this home controller for us, and in addition to that, it doesn't return any sort of actual view here. But so let's go ahead and let's see if we can actually hit this home controller, because I want to show you that the way our routes are set up, that we're going to end up having an issue. So when we run the application, you should be greeted with this message, and I actually wanted to explain this here. What this is saying is that it's like, hey, we have some sort of middleware called use MVC, but we don't know how to handle this because you never registered this in configure services. So any sort of custom middleware, any sort of custom request response pipelining code that you might have, it has to be registered through this configure services. And then the configure services is actually passed in here. So it's registered one time and then used every time a request is made. So let's go ahead and look at how we can actually tap into that. So when we go, let's go ahead into this function here. And what we want to go, and we want to reference this services object. And we're going to say services add MVC. And you can see there's this add MVC option. And then we need to call it as a function. And then we're going to say, let's set our compatibility version. And since we're on compatibility version dot, we're on 2.1. So we're going to say, you know what, we need 2.1 in order for this application to work. So now that we've registered this add MVC, we can now use MVC in our route. So if we run the application, it shouldn't blow up now when we run. Now you can see it doesn't blow up, which is good. If we go to our index.html, that should still be rendered just fine. There it is, hello from your mom. Now if we go to the home controller, though, this is where I want to show you. I should be able to go to this home controller and just be like, you know what, home index by default. Let's see if it gets returned, but it doesn't. So if I go to 1 though, you can see, I did this, now got processed by the server, and you can see that Microsoft.NET Core actually threw a error. It says there's no index that matches this parameter here. There's no way that we can serve up a response to this. So in order to fix that, it's because we hard-coded this ID in here. So if you wanted to abide by this ID pattern here, you need to go to the controller, and we would have to have a view that takes in a parameter, an int that, let me stop my server, and we would have to have this say int ID. Okay, so then we're gonna return, and then what I want to do here, I also want to add our view that needs to be returned. So there's a shorthand. If we right click and say add view, we can go over here and we're going to add our view, and we're just going to say it's a template without a model. We're not going to use a layout page. Let's go ahead and just say add, and this is going to build scaffolding as well, and really all it's doing is it's just putting the home folder inside of your views, and then it puts the index inside here. So we're going to say hello from MVC. All right, so now if we run the app and we go to this page, we should be able to navigate to it. We're not doing anything with the parameter that's being passed in, but it is a requirement in order for that route to be hit. So again, let's go to home, and then we're just going to say index, and then we'll just say 1. So then we now get the response. So now if we don't have 1 on here, you can see that index is not returned. You're like, so why is that? But if you have 1, it's because the route has to match up perfectly in order for this to be rendered. If we want to fix that functionality, we would go back into our startup file and we would say, you know what, the ID parameter is something that I do not want to have, I don't want it to be a requirement. So I'm just going to say, you know what, I'm going to make that optional. So let me stop the server again. And by using the question mark, the ID is now optional. So it's not something that has to be passed in. And let's run the app again. And if we go to home index and without the ID, you can now see that it does get passed in. And the reason why that works is because the action by default, it's going to look for an action with the name index, and we already have one called index. So that's why this is being returned even when you don't pass the optional ID in. Now clearly if you did pass in the ID, we would do some sort of custom functionality inside of here. But that is a demonstration on how we get MVC.NET involved in our application stack. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. If you have, if you're looking for web development techniques, like some of the more modern stuff for 2019, I have this new course that you should check out on Udemy. There is a discount link in the description tab below. But this is going to cover literally everything that is being touched upon by most web developers when it comes to front-end development. So JavaScript, the Sass, Webpack, Bootstrap, all that stuff. So it really covers everything in there. So make sure you guys check that out if you're interested in that. Hey guys, what up? Welcome back. So in this video, let's go ahead and touch the models, and let's go ahead and create our first model and find out how to actually send it back to our view. So in our controllers here, you're going to see that it actually just returns the standard view for our home controller. We want to go ahead and add a model, and the model, we're just going to have, it'll be a new class, and we'll just call this, we'll just say it's like a book. So we'll just call it a book. So what do books have? They have a couple of properties on them. This is where we actually define what are the model properties that we're going to have. So we're going to have a public string title, because every book has a title. And then for now, we're going to have a public string of author. All right, there we go. So now that we have this model defined, what we can do is we can now create a separate controller. And before I even do that, well, yeah, you know what? I want to show you guys, I want to show you, because I don't want to show you guys the scaffolding, because the scaffolding doesn't actually show you what's going on behind the scenes. Let's go ahead and edit the actual home let's go ahead and pass down the model here to our view. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, you know what, inside of our method here, we're going to go ahead and we're going to new up a, we'll just call this new up my model to be descripted equals new, and then it's the name of our model, so it's a new book. All right, so by saying that, you're going to get these squiggly lines, and if we double click on that, you're going to see that it's actually going to say you need to use your first application.models, so that way we know what the book is. So now they know what the book is. In fact, we can even do shorthand and instantiate the actual values here. So we're going to say the title equals Chris is a great, and I actually don't really think that, but anyway, and then author is Chris Hawks. All right, there we go. So let's go ahead and we can do a semicolon there. It's not going to hurt anything. And then in order to pass the model to our view, we just have to say new up model. All right, so now if we go and we run the application and we go to the actual page, we're going to see that there's really no difference here, but I just want to show you why. So if we go to home index, you're going to see that it's just delivering up the standard HTML. There's really no change, and the reason why is because we're not actually using our model. So in order to actually be able to use our model inside of here, so in order to do that, all we need to do is just reference our model, and we're going to use this keyword, the model keyword, and then we just have to go ahead and spell out to where it can be found. So first application.models.books. So now that we have that in here, we can now use this model inside of our template. So instead of this hello from MVC, we're going to actually reference the model. So Razor shorthand by convention is you're going to want to you could just actually say model dot, but there needs to be an at symbol for anything. So you're going to say model dot. You can see clearly that we have an author and a title in here. So we're going to say author dot title, and then inside of a paragraph tag, we'll just say model dot author. All right. So you can see once you reference your model, you can now reference your actual data. Now, this actual template engine that comes with .NET, and it's come with MVC.NET for a long time now, it's called the Razor template engine, and it's server-side code that is generated, and essentially it's building up a bunch of HTML and passing it back from the server. All this Razor stuff is processed on the server, and it's a very convenient way for most web applications that need basic templating. So now that we've referenced that, let's go ahead and run the application, see if we can actually get those values that we're passing in. If you remember correctly, I think it was Chris is great or something like that, and then Chris Hawks is the author. So let's go ahead and check out the home index method, and then there it is, Chris is great, Chris Hawks. So that's dynamic data, and that's good. That's coming from the controller. So obviously this template right here can be reused over and over and over again, and because it's just referencing these variable placeholders, it's dynamic, meaning that it responds differently based on the values that you pass into it. So this value itself is obviously hard-coded into the controller, but most likely you're going to be reaching out to some sort of database or something like that and getting whatever sort of data was requested and returned to the template. But what we want to look at is the layout page. And the reason why the layout page is beneficial is because then we can reuse a lot of our code, so we don't have to redefine all this code that's in the head and in the closing body, HTML, things like that. So what we're going to do is use the layout page, and that's going to have all the common code inside of it. And then we're going to have pages that will derive and use that layout page to just inject pieces into certain areas of the layout. So let's go ahead and look into how we're going to do that. So by convention, there's usually a shared folder inside of the views folder that we're going to go ahead and create right now. We're going to call this shared. And then inside of the shared, let's go ahead and say add and new item and go to the web. And we're going to select Razor layout and just go ahead and have the default layout _layout. That's fine. So now that we've added it, we have this layout, and you can see that there's this render body. So let's how do we go ahead and we get our home page to use that layout page. So in order to use the layout page, you can see if we go to our normal home index page that the layout is null. So it's just a string that it's expecting. If you hover over it, you can see that it's expecting a string. So we just have to give it the string, which is the location of where it can be found in the project. We're going to use the tilde here, so that is the root directory. Look inside the views, inside the shared, and then the name of our layout file, which is layout CS.html, and that should be that. All right, so that's our string, and now that we're using that, And if it doesn't find it, if Visual Studio doesn't find it, you should end up getting an error message there. But now that we have this layout page, we don't have to have all this HTML stuff. This content right here is going to be injected into the body of the layout page by default, this render body right here. So let's go ahead and run it and take a look. So pulling it up in the browser, there it is. You can see Chris is great. What we're going to be doing is adding a new page to our application. I want to show you how easy it is to use the scaffolding within Visual Studio. So if we stop our server, make sure it's not running, right click on controllers, and we're going to say add. And from here, if we just say add controller, we can select an MVC controller and just say add. This is where we're going to give it a name. So I'm going to call it a music controller and click add. So you'll notice that it's actually, it has an index method built for us by default, but if we look at the view, there is no view created for us. So if we want to create a view, if you right click on view, you can just say add view. And then here we can use the benefit of saying, you know what, this one's going to have a model. I want to use a model, so it's going to be a list model. And the list is going to be, we have the name book. Yeah, that's the only model we have right now, but let's go ahead and we'll just use book for right now. That's fine. And this is where we can say we want to use our layout page, and you can go ahead and go under your views and go to shared and click your layout page and say add. And now we'll have an entirely new section of the website. So if we want to navigate to it, instead of saying home, we're going to say music. So when we run the application and we go over here, and where we used to say home index, we're now going to say music index. And here what you're going to see is an exception, and by default ASP.NET is going to have your debugging session information available to you. Like, you would never want this information available to the public, because then a hacker would be able to exploit you. But this is something you do want to have in front of you whenever you need to debug. So it tells you right here what the problem is. When we used the scaffolding and we said that we wanted to list out items, it was assuming that we were going to be sending down a list of data that we never did. In fact, it was assuming a list of books, and we never did. So you can see that there's a for each statement inside of this this template. So if we look inside of the index.cshtml where this is being thrown, you'll see that there's a for each statement right here, and this is where it's blowing up, because inside of the model it's expecting a list of values and there's not. So in order to fix that, we'd have to go to the controller, and we go to the music controller, and clearly here we need to be passing down a list of book values. So we'll just say var my list equals new list of book, and we'll just instantiate one new book. New book. And here, let's go ahead and click on this, and this is where we're going to use IntelliSense. You click on the light bulb, and then you can go ahead and it'll recommend for you what to do, or you can do this. You can have it selected and press Control dot, and it'll do the same thing. It'll pull up in IntelliSense, and you click on that, it'll add the using statement, and everything's fine. So now you get the IntelliSense that you want, like the title equals, you know, we're gonna have like a movie title, whatever, and then author equals Mel Gibson. Now we're getting all confused, right? We have music, books, and movies. All right, so now that we've done this, we want to go ahead and return our list. So we're going to return my list to the template. If we run the application again, we should actually be okay. We're only going to have one list or one item listed out, but it's not going to blow up, because the for each statement will at least have something to work with. Okay, all right, so we go to music index. All right, and there you go. So inside of our thing, you can see that we have this create new. That should be like a link or a button or something like that, but here's our title, and then you can go and you can edit these values. All right, so I'm tired of our application looking like an ugly, old, outdated thing. So I want to get you guys excited. So let's go ahead and download a Bootstrap modern theme. And this is a free website that you can go to where you can download this free product. It's a website. It's going to be zipped up. And what we want to do is we want to extract the contents of the folder to the location of our website. So let's go over here. And you can see all the CSS and vendor stuff and everything. We want to go ahead and extract that to wherever our project is. So in my case, I have it under tutorials, under net core first application. So I have to actually go all the way into the application of that and find the root directory, and I'm going to say OK. You'll probably get a collision on the CSS directory, possibly, I guess, maybe not. And then let's go ahead and extract also the index.html. And we're going to extract this as the layout page. So really, let's for right now, I'll go ahead and put it inside of. I'll put it as near as I can to the project because we're going to need it, but we're not. I don't want to just overwrite the. I'll just put it in the root for right now. That's fine. Yeah, we'll replace the existing index. All right, so now by doing that, if we go ahead and we look at this index.html that we overwrote, you're going to see the new theme, and that's really awesome. But one thing that you might have to do if you don't see it is if you have this inspector window open in Chrome by right-clicking and saying inspect element, it'll open up this inspector panel, which you need to be very familiar with as a web developer. And if you hold down the refresh button, you can see an empty cache and hard reload. You may have to do that. Sometimes the Kestrel web server will actually cache your index or static content. So that includes any sort of index.html files that you might have in there, or any CSS files. You might be like, why isn't this updating? So make sure you refresh the cache a lot. Another thing you can do is if you inspect and you go over to the console, or you know what, no, I'm sorry, it's network, and then there's a disable cache right here, so you can make sure Chrome is not caching anything as well. But sometimes the actual server will cache stuff, and that's why you still have to restart and then also cache, just delete the cache from your browser. So while this is really pretty, it's not that cool because this is just a static HTML page that never changes, and that's not really what the web is all about. So let's go ahead and add some functionality here. And what I want to do is take all the contents of this index.html from the root directory. I'm going to go into the layout, and I'm going to replace all this stuff right here. And then inside of the body somewhere, we'll say... so I guess somewhere above the footer here, just for an example, inside of a section, you know what, let's not even do that. We're just going to say @render body. All right. You don't need a semicolon, by the way, in Razor syntax. So we're going to render the body right there for right now. And then at the top, let's go ahead and add our view bag to the title so we can remove the default and make sure it's working. So we'll say @viewbag.title. Yeah, title. So this is a good time to probably briefly touch about Razor, but anything that is using an @ symbol, that has an @ symbol before it, is going to be followed by actual C# code that's going to be executed on the server. So this is actual C#, basically memory, that session memory that is available, that gets passed down to the view, and you can actually set the title to whatever you want from the controller, and by the default it should have the controller's actual name, or maybe null, I don't remember, but it's not that important. So let's make sure all this is working. We're going to stop real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and replay it, and instead of going to the index.html, I want to go to the music.index. And then now you can see that, all right, we're in here, but what we have is a problem with our static content. Our static content can no longer be found, and we'll have to understand the reason why. And the reason why is because the actual links are all messed up. You can see what it's looking for is it's looking for all these values inside of like music, vendor, font awesome, things like that, and there's actually no folder for that. So what is the problem? The problem is that it's looking at the relative directory and not the root directory of the project. And once again, it's going to be the same thing for the home page as well. So you have to go through and actually update the links to all the static content in order to fix this. And normally what I mean by that is you have to go through this painstaking process of being like, you know what, CSS and blah, blah, blah. And it's then going to find it and all this stuff. Instead of looking, you could use the tilde and all that. The better thing to do is actually just remember the name of it and use Visual Studio for its power. So stylish portfolio min. Okay. So if I go into the CSS, stylish portfolio min, I just drag it right in there. And you can see that it's doing that for you. Unfortunately I can't like drag and replace it, but here's some vendor stuff. So this vendor stuff is missing. So here's simple line icons from the vendor. So simple line icons. Oh God, I don't even remember which one that was. So that's where this is, this kind of sucks, so maybe it's even better to just go ahead and use the tilde, and just like that. That's probably better actually to go through than to try to drag, but you could drag or you could just go through and manually update all these links. So now that I've updated all those links and I go back and I restart the server and I go back to the home index page, you can see now that we're actually using MVC with ASP.NET Core with a modern Bootstrap pretty looking theme that we can actually replace some of this content and have a very professional website if you stop the tutorial right now with just what you've learned so far. So there's a lot that you can do obviously from here, and we're going to get into much more. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. If you have, if you're looking for web development techniques, like some of the more modern stuff for 2019, I have this new course that you should check out on Udemy. There is a discount link in the description tab below, but this is going to cover literally everything that is being touched upon by most web developers when it comes to, front-end development. So JavaScript, the Sass, Webpack, Bootstrap, all that stuff. So it really covers everything in there. So make sure you guys check that out if you're interested in that. All right, guys. So in this video, what I want to do is actually just go ahead and we're going to create a few classes that I want to add. I'm going to add a new class here that's going to be more in line with what our theme is for this website, which is more of a music website. So we're going to have a band.cs file, and bands are also going to have, similar to what we had in the book, we're going to have both. We're going to have a title. Okay, so we'll have a title, a genre, an origin, and then we'll just have the biography. All right, so just those 4 key elements on the band. All right, and now that we have that, let's go to the music controller. And the music is, instead of returning a list of books, it's going to return a list of bands. And now the band is going to be called Bayside. And this is going to be a new band. Origin equals genre equals alternative, and then finally what, biography. We're not going to do this. We'll say blah blah blah. All right, so there we go. So we have one band, and now let's go ahead and add a few more bands just because we feel like we need to have a new band. So now another thing too is I want to move my list out of this scope from just this index method. I want to have it publicly available to the class, which means I have to declare what type it is. So it's a list of band, and we should probably have a better name for that, but whatever. All right, so there we go. All right, and then finally what I want to do is go ahead and add another page, which we're going to have action result, and this is going to be called add. So this is where we're going to add a new band to our page. So if we're going to be adding a new band, in this case, we're not going to be posting anything. So we'll see in just a moment. This is just going to go ahead and create a new view model. So we'll say variable view model equals new band. All right, and then we're going to pass that view model down to the view. So we'll say return this dot view, pass in the band, and not that, or no, the view model. I'm sorry. Why are you doing that to me? All right. All All right, so now this ad, you're gonna see it's complaining. It says it doesn't return a value because blah blah blah, and that's because you're not returning this dot view. So you need to say return this dot view, and now it's gonna stop complaining. But there is no view, so we need to go ahead and add our view. And since we're using a model, we're gonna be doing a create, which means a form, and we can go ahead and create a band. So we can add the band model, and it's gonna use the layout page. And we're going to add that. All right, now what we also need to do is we need to update our layout page because right now the layout page has way too much stuff in it. So if we go over to the layout page, you're gonna see all this this content up here, like all these callouts and stuff like that. Like, so basically we probably want the header in most of the pages, but like this about and the services and all this stuff, I don't know what all this junk is about. But we're gonna get rid of all that for right now. And we're gonna put that inside of the home. So instead of this, we're going to put this inside of the home, and that should be rendered only on the home page then. And the shared page is going to have much less stuff in there, but I think the body should still probably be inside of a section based on the CSS of this Bootstrap theme that we're using. All right, so we're going to have that inside of a section. All right, looks like we have a pretty cleaned up application. Now let's go ahead and press play and run this thing. All right, so we're going to navigate over to home index. And then now you can see that we get the full thing like we had with our layout before. That's fine. Now, but if we go to music and we go to the index, we're still not, it's complaint, you mother F. Oh, that's right, because we didn't update the template. So if we go over to the template, we need to update the template for this music index file, because if you remember correctly, this is a list of bands. So we're going to say this create new. We'll get into that in just a second, actually. I'm not going to get into that right this second. This is going to say our list of bands. All right. And then we need to go up and we need to update the model to use band and not book, since that's what it's iterating over. And it looks like this is all good. And we don't want the author, the title. We want the genre probably next, and then since we're in a table, we'll just continue that for right now. And we have the genre, and then the origin, and then the biography. All right, so those are those four elements of our band, and then here obviously we have a problem as well. We need to, we'll just say origin. But we also need to, yeah, so shoot. No, we need that to be in order, jeez. This needs to be a genre. Come on. And then this needs to be biography. All right, so now our headers should match up to our data, and we're good. All right, let's go ahead and stop this, restart it. And if we go over there, we now have the layout being found and all that stuff. And then inside this this data, we now have the ad. We can see that this they created this form for us in the scaffolding, meaning the .NET application using Visual Studio. So what I want to do is replace this section render body right here, and I'm going to replace it with just a container. So I want the Bootstrap container to do the render body. You shouldn't have to restart the server. You should be able to just be able to refresh. And if you do that, you can see that the changes take effect right away. And here we have some information that is it's really lacking here. It's not giving us any helpful information as to what information we're filling out here. It does tell us that we're adding a band. I guess that's sort of helpful. One thing's for sure as well, it seems like every page doesn't need this header. So let's go ahead and fix that as well as the final thing that we're going to do. So let's go to the layout, and actually, yeah, the layout. I'm going to get rid of this header piece right here. That should probably only be on the in the home controller, I'm sorry, the home page here. So let's go ahead and add this to the top. Okay, all right, there we go. And this once again should be able to take effect right away. So if you guys have noticed that sometimes your web server may not take your changes into effect even though you clear your cache and things like that. So what you may want to do is actually disable any sort of caching from occurring from the actual Kestrel web server. And you can do that by pasting your code inside of this configure method. Now you can see when I paste this in, what I need to do is import the headers that I'm referencing here. So you can see that now every request that's made to the server, we're not going to cache it anymore. So I also want to show you guys another trick that we can do, that this code here that is defining our routes here, since it's actually using the default template, and the default actually says find the home controller, find the index method, and find the ID. We can actually replace all of this with just one line of code, just to make things a little bit more concise, and make sure that goes after the app static files. But that will do the exact same thing that we saw before. It's just a little bit more shorthand. And we'll see later on that when we do want to custom override that behavior, we still have the option of doing so. But if we fire up the app, you can see that it still uses the default index page just like we would normally expect. What I just want to show you also as well that this is actually just automatically defaulting to the index. But I do want to show you guys that real quickly, I did delete the music controller that we had from the previous video, because I wanted to show you in the previous video we had to go through all that work of setting up the route and getting a form and everything already created for us. But what I want to show you is that since we have this band object defined, which is our model object, we can go ahead and create a controller that is based off of that model object that does so much of the work that we just saw in the previous video for us. And we do that by using the scaffolding that's built into Visual Studio Code. So you have to, or Visual Studio, you have to make sure it's not running. Right click on controllers. We're going to say add, and then we're going to add a new controller. And then from here, you're going to want to say MVC controller with read write actions. And then here we're going to give it the name of our music controller. And the music controller now has all of this information that we need. So you have the ability to go to the details page and pass in an ID for whatever sort of musician you want to find. You can create a new one. And the best part about this is that when we go to our music controller and we right click on like this create, we could say add view, and it automatically knows. It's like, okay, well, what do you want to do? Grab the create. Okay, that's what we want. And then we say, you know what, you're going to be creating a band object. So by doing all this, it's going to go ahead and just create the views that we need, and it's going to just scaffold it all out into everything that we need. And it has some built-in stuff that is pretty helpful. But you can see it's putting all the labels on us on this for us. You can see that it matches up the labels to the inputs and all that. So there's all this form code that you don't have to actually write yourself. Let me go back here. So you do have to create the views though for the individual pages. Like here, we're going to say add view again. Once again, this one, you just select that we're getting the details of the model class, and the model class is band, and just click add. Now, most likely the index page is actually going to be the page that lists out all the bands. So this would most likely be our list page of all the bands here. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to put this as a list, and then a list of bands, and then we'll use the layout page. So now if we fire up our web server and we go to the create page, you can see that our labels still aren't actually working properly. And I'll show you why in just a moment. We'll see that in the next video. But I do want to show you that the values are all here and everything for us. So if we wanted to go into the music, you would go into detail and we would say musician 1. But in our case, we don't actually have that page, and it doesn't even know where to find that. In fact, you don't even say that. You just pass in the actual ID of the detail that you're trying to get. Sorry, the server's not even running. So when all else fails, look at your controller and look at what it is you're doing. So obviously I can see that it's going to be music details in order to be able to hit that. So if I run this music details, and then you would pass in whatever sort of ID of the detail you get, you can see that we don't get any sort of value back here. But if you did have a value, this is where you'd want to query it and then return the view with the populated values. We'll also see that in a future video as well. Hey everybody, welcome back. So in the last video, we saw how to create a form using scaffolding material, and I want to show you how the labels are not showing up here. So if you look at the actual HTML inside of our Razor template, you can see that there is a label here, and it says that there's a label for a title, but there is no value in here. So if you wanted the label, you'd have to say, value, our values. You'd have to go through and add all that. Now there's a better way of doing it actually, and that is using Razor's built-in syntax. Razor is the view engine for MVC.net. And all you have to do is use the @ symbol and then say HTML and then dot. And there's going to be all kinds of then helpful different Razor extension methods that are used for this this templating system that makes your job a little bit easier. So we're going to look at how to use the label for. And it's a lambda expression that you have to then pass into this label for. And the lambda is just simply going to iterate over the model. And it's going to return the label for the title. And there's no semicolon needed, by the way, in Razor. So now we have this input here, and while we're at it, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing for here. So I'm going to say HTML input input. So that's actually going to be text box 4. So it's a little bit different. So like inputs or text boxes for this. So we're going to say title. And then finally, there's also built-in validation too. So we'll see how all that works. We're going to say validation message 4. And again, another lambda in here. And as you can see, it's the same thing every time we're going to our model. So we have these 3 values here. And now that we have the validation, we don't need that. So that's like a shorthand way of actually getting your actual inputs to show up. And let me show you the reason why this is helpful. So if I stop the server and I restart it. So if we go back over to this, now what you can see is because we're now using this free-form shorthand, you can see that we now have the title. Now the prettiness is not there because it's not using the Bootstrap theme anymore. So you can see it's not using that, that styling, but we'll see how to do that in just a second. But as you can see here, the title and everything is created automatically. So let's get that cleaned up a little bit. Let's go back over to the create. And for this, I want to go ahead and just, I want to take all these values and I'm going to then paste them into here. And obviously we want to change the actual value to our genre. All right, so now that we have all those in here, I want to show you what a data annotation is. So if we go over to the band model file, and a shorthand way to get there is if you click on the actual band portion and press F12, it'll automatically navigate to it. We can use something that are called data annotations now in order to start basically applying different labels and fields and things like that on our inputs. So if I wanted to say display, I'm going to say display, and then I can give this a like a value. So in order to do that, I'm just going to add a custom attribute on here called display. And then display can take a value called name, and the name is going to be whatever you want it to show up as for the label. So in this case, I'll say enter the name of the band or musician. Okay, and then like if we do this for all of them, we can manage all these values, all this metadata on the actual model itself. And for right now, I'll just have, this is kind of crappy messaging for right now. We'll just do this, and then we'll say, all right, that's good. So now if we go ahead and run the app, so now when we look at this, you can see that the actual values for the labels that I gave under that name for the data annotation is actually now showing up for the label, and that's what we want. One thing is that the biography is probably not suited for an actual text box, so we want that to be a text area. So in order to fix that, we would go back over to the template, and where it says text box 4, we would say text area 4. And then that will show up as a text area. And we probably also need some sort of a BR after our label, which is interesting because some of these other ones do not have it. So actually the reason why this is occurring is the labels here are long enough to actually push the div, the next div down, because you can see how wide the form group is. It's in a column 4, so you can see the label pushes the. So technically, in order to fix something like that, you would want to go back to the razor, and after every input, you would want some sort of a BR tag maybe. That's one way, or even better, you'd want some sort of styling in there. But for right now, for the quick and dirty, we're just going to do this. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. If you have, if you're looking for web development techniques, like some of the more modern stuff for 2019, I have this new course that you should check out on Udemy. There is a discount link in the description tab below. But this is going to cover literally everything that is being touched upon by most web developers when it comes to front-end development. So JavaScript, the Sass, Webpack, Bootstrap, all that stuff. So it really covers everything in there. So make sure you guys check that out if you're interested in that. Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. So in this video, I want to show you how to post values up from your form. There's also a built-in Razor form helper that's going to be able to help you out here, because normally you have to like spell out exactly where you want this thing to post to. But what I want to do is go ahead and just remove this validation from our form. Make sure you just pause the video right here and just make sure you have the same thing from the previous video. And if you don't, just make sure we're going to be getting rid of this part. But here I want to go ahead and use the helper, and we're going to say using. And then we're going to say HTML, and then inside of here, we're going to say we're going to say using, and then inside of parentheses, HTML.begin form. And then inside of here, the first thing we do is we give it the name of the method that we want to hit, or the function that is on the controller class. And then the second thing is we want to give it the name of the controller itself, which is music. All right, so after these two parentheses, you want to have the curly braces, and you want all the form elements to be inside the curly braces. And since this is a form helper using Razor, you don't need the closing form statement. What I want to do is go over to the music controller. I have a couple of breakpoints set here. I just want to have it on the try and then also on the catch in case there's a problem. But this was a endpoint that was created for us by default. So you're going to notice that we have these HTTP post attributes. That's the way the MVC application is able to tell the difference between, okay, you want the create form page, or oh, you're posting the values from the create form page. So that's why the post is going to signify the difference between the two. The validate anti-forgery token is actually something that is involved in cross-site scripting. It's a common hacking attack. You guys can look it up. It's beyond the scope of this tutorial, but it's cross-site scripting. But this is to prevent that. So by default, MVC has protections in place to try to protect you from making mistakes. So let's go ahead and fire up the application and navigate over to our create page. And here we go. Let's go ahead and give some names of some stuff. We'll put in Chris, alternative, country, USA, like me. I'm just kidding. This is so pompous and arrogant. I'm actually not like that. So biography, I'm from Virginia. Okay. All right, so now what we're going to do is we are going to get a problem, because what this thing did is it redirected to the music site. And unfortunately this did not work at all. 1 second. So the code's fine. Just make sure you restart your server. And I'm not really sure if this is something to do with my local setup or not, but the caching thing really sucks. But if you guys go ahead and put some values in here, and then we click create. Now this is going to go ahead and hit the breakpoint. So if we look over the collection value, you can see that there are a few keys inside of here that title, genre, origin, biography, things like that. And if we wanted to see the actual results of those values, we could actually just hover over the collection and then go to the results view. And then you can see down in here, you can see that the title passed in is ADF, genres ADF, ADF for all of them. But you can see there. And then there's also this request verification token. So that's this humongous like base 64 encrypted token. So you can see why the page actually errors out, because it actually hits the redirect to action right here, and then it just bounces right over to the main page, and it tries to for each over a model of band values that doesn't exist. So for just for craps and gigs, let's go ahead and just return the view as well, from this view as well, so that way you have to stop the server, but that way it'll not error out every time for right now. Now, normally in your try statement here, this is where you're going to end up validating server side the values that are passed in, and we'll see how to do that in a moment. And then there's also the fact, this is where you would store, or call out to some sort of third-party service or something to pass values in, or to get values based on the values you have. But obviously, the sky's the limit there, and then catch is where everything blows up and your server's on fire. Hey guys, so in this video I want to show you guys how to make a GET request in order to using Ajax and a common JavaScript method in order to just get some data and everything that you want to be able to view. So on this details here, let's go ahead and for whatever integer you pass in, it doesn't really matter. We're going to go ahead and return a new view of data. So let's go ahead and make sure we have our view in here. And we're going to say that it is with the model, and the model is going to be a details model, and it's going to be of the class band. And it's going to use the layout. So we're going to go ahead and add that a file with the name detail. Oh, okay. So we already have that in there, but we're going to go ahead and replace it anyway, just so we're starting fresh here. All right, so this should pull it up here. So now we go over to music and we look at the details here. You can see it's just actually iterating over all the values of our data here, and it's displaying the names of the data elements here. So if you guys are wondering what the display name for and the display for is, the display for is actually displaying the data. The display name for, though, on the other hand, is actually a data attribute that you can define on your model class using the display here. So this display is actually going to show up in our details page, just like we saw it with the label for as well, that uses the display. So now what I'm going to do at the bottom of all this this data display here, I'm just going to go ahead and add a button, and this is going to be rough looking. I don't even know what it's going to look like, but we'll see what it looks like here. And we'll just say Ajax test is the name of the button, and we'll just say Ajax get, because this is going to be a get request, because there is a difference between a get and a post. And what we want to do is we're going to have another let's put it inside of this entire thing's a mess. All right, number one, this will all go inside of a div class container and a div class row. And I'm going to drop all that in there. And then inside this row, I do want this to be a class column MD of 6. Okay, I did not want that closed off. God dang it. All right, so column MD of 6 and get rid of that. All right, so now we have this MD of 6. I'm going to close that down because right after that MD of 6, I also want to go ahead and do another, and we're going to say div ID equals data. So we'll put our data inside of this div ID. And for now, I also want to go ahead and put my button. I want to take that out of this other column that we have, and I want to put that down in here inside of this div at the bottom. So just a simple button. And this is here where you can see that we probably have to be a little bit more careful with our display labels, because they can be reused, and if you're too like specific with words like enter the and things like that you may not need, like even here this should probably just say like it should say something alternate to what this is, because otherwise it would show up as biography. Like for instance, let's get rid of the biography label here, and you can see that the effect is the same. So it's actually using the name of the actual property by default, but if you put a display name, it's going to use that instead of the actual property. Now if we wanted to display the actual value, that's again, you go back over to the details, and that's what display for is going to be doing. Right now we don't have any values. Well, why? It's because we're not actually populating anything here. So this is where we want to go ahead and create a new band object. So we're going to say we have to stop the server, and we're going to say a variable band equals new band. And then we're going to instantiate a few things. So I think there's a name or something like that, or title, right? Come on. We want to make sure that this thing's included. So sometimes if your IntelliSense or anything like that starts getting jacked up, you need to go over to the build and clean your solution. It's actually a common thing, unfortunately. I don't know why. So you can see that the IntelliSense started working once we cleaned it, and then we click on the light bulb and it tells you to go ahead and bring in your band model. So now we can see if we go and put the title, we could say biography. Shoot. So normally if you're typing and you press tab, it should just go ahead and start, it should work. And genre origin equals your mom's house, and the genre equals country. Trying to be all inclusive out there for everybody that likes everything. All right, so now what we're going to do is in order to get this data, we want to go ahead and return our band object. All right, so now when we go ahead and we visit the data page, now we're going to get the static information return. So now you can see when we return back, we get the actual label and we get the data. Now, the problem is that this is obviously static data. What you would want to do is you'd want to take this value that gets passed in, and this value would be the identifier that you would use to look up the band object from your database or wherever you're trying to look it up from. And then you would end up returning the data instead of the hard-coded data. But this is how you would basically set up your template, and obviously you would want much more detail there. So let's go ahead and get back to making our GET request. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this statement right here, and I'm actually going to return a different band object. So I want to go ahead and just say details, and we're just going to say test. So it's going to be called, actually we'll be very explicit, test get band. And it doesn't need anything passed into it. It's just simply going to be a request to the endpoint. And this is going to be returning a new band. And this is a new biography. Your mom's house is now new, and country sucks mostly. All right. So this is going to go ahead and return the band. Now, by default, because you did not specify a post like you did down here, it's going to be a GET by default. So you don't have to worry about doing that when you just want a normal GET request. So what we want our AJAX call to do is, from our details page, we're going to have a button, which we've already added. And this button ID, AJAX test, is going to fire a script. And we want a script to be located after all of this information, because this is a little bit hackish, and normally you'd want this in some sort of external file or something like that. But for this, the purposes of this example, we're not going to worry about that. So in this script body here, what I want you to do is go ahead and paste in this statement. And this is using the new fetch API, which is a JavaScript standard for making AJAX calls. And you can see it's hitting the music controller, test get band, which is our new endpoint. And then test get band is going to be returning some data. Now, one of the things you might want to notice here is that it's expecting JSON data to be returned. And most everybody is actually returning JSON data these days. So let's go ahead and do the same thing. All right, so one of the things before I get into the serialization I want to show you is that if we go to our page, instead of the button, you can see that we did not wire the page up to the actual button click. So this is just going to fire as soon as the page loads. It's going to make the AJAX call. So I went ahead and I put a breakpoint on the new endpoint that we have, this test band get, just to show you that the AJAX request is going through via JavaScript and that the response is coming back. So going back to the browser, if I reload the page, you can see that we hit our application. It's returning the band object back. The browser's not really going to be able to make any sense of all that data because it's actually trying to return an entire HTML web page back via an AJAX response. But if we went over to the browser and we inspect and we go to our network, and if we want to go ahead and if you say preserve log here, just let's continue to let this thing process through. It actually probably won't capture it, but let's go ahead and refresh it one more time. Yeah, I messed that up. Let me do this one more time. All right, so I'm going to clear the log. Make sure you have preserve log on. Refresh. And then you can see the response that's coming back here. So you did a get, and then the response that's that you got back is right up in here. So you can see an entire HTML web page got returned. So that's not really what we want. So in the next video, we're going to see how to serialize our data object to JSON and return just the JSON data object. So there is a difference between C# classes and JavaScript objects, and unfortunately you can't just send down a C# object across the wire and expect that the browser is going to understand what to do with it. So they speak the common language that they both understand, which is the JSON data format. And there is a project called json.net. So we're going to look at installing a package. And what we do is we go to our tools, and we're going to go into NuGet Package Manager and then go into the console. And we're going to be searching for a project called json.net. And that is actually, and in fact, I didn't really want the console. I wanted the managed NuGet package for the solution. This is where we're going to go. I'm going to browse on here. And here I can say json.net. And you can see here's newtonsoft.json. So this is actually faster than Microsoft's built-in serialization here. So what you're going to want to do is you want to just say, I want to add it to my first project or my first application project, and I just simply install. So if you guys have ever used if you've ever used npm like with Node, this is the same thing. NuGet is Microsoft's package manager, and if you're coming from a Python background, then it would be like pip. All right, so now that we have that included in our project, we can go ahead and close this down. And on the band object here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to serialize it to JSON, and I'm going to use this library that we just installed. So it's going to say JSON convert, and then we're going to say serialize, and then we serialize the band object. So we need to import the JSON. So say using newtonsoft.json, and so it's actually not serialized, it's serialized object. And again, I have to bring this in. So anyway, there's a lot of different libraries, so it's difficult to keep up with all of them. But if you hover over, you can see that this serializes the specified object to a JSON string. So what I want to show you guys, if you actually run the server after making that change to the code, and if you look at your console when we made the Ajax call, you're going to see that we get this error message, and by clicking on it, it's actually going to pull up the error message which you actually want to see. And here you can just see that we're getting the standard that the view is not found. And the reason why is if we go back over to the controller, you can see that it's expecting an action result type to be returned, which is return, view. But view is actually returning, a bunch of HTML characters and things, and we just want to return a JSON string. So what I could do here is I could change this. I could stop the server, and I could change this over to a JSON result. And then I could say return JSON. And then you just simply say, you serialize it just like we did before. And now by making that change, you can see instead of giving the 500 error, we're actually returning the JSON string that we're looking for. So inside of your JavaScript, you can see all these / characters. What you would end up doing is you would end up then JSON parsing it from within your HTML. So if we go back over to the HTML here, and go into the details page, and here where we're console logging, you can see we're JSON stringifying it, but let's just not do that. Let's actually, because really we want an actual object for the most part. That's what we're going to use for any sort of modern UI. It's going to take in a JSON object. So if we make that change and we refresh, you can see that we're now getting a straight JSON data object back. All right, so what I want to show you guys in this video is in the past video, you saw that if we submitted the form, it submitted an iForm collection, and you saw that it posted the values. But what I actually want to do is I want to post a specific band model, and I'll call this band. And for right now, we're not going to do anything with it. We can get rid of this comment too. I don't need that in there. So we're going to go ahead and post up the band. And I want to explain that ASP.NET is actually going to automatically bind data objects that are passed up, that are posted to the server, that match up to a view model object. So if it has the right, properties like name, title, or origin, genre, biography, whatever it is, it's going to automatically serialize and bind up those data attributes and basically take a JSON data object and then create a C# object from it. If everything goes well. If not, you'll see like a bunch of null values. So in order to post, let's go ahead and change our fetch method here. And what I want to do is I'm going to change this over to our create method just as an example. And then inside of here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in an argument, which is a dictionary argument here. And this takes a bunch of key value pairs. So we're going to say method equals post, and then body equals data. And what we want to do is go ahead and define our data object. And remember, our data object is a band object. So the band object needs to have all the values that a band has, which is title, genre, origin, and biography. So title, genre, origin, and biography. All right, there we go. All right, so that's our data object, and we're going to go ahead and pass that up, and we're going to use the fetch method, fetch API in order to do so. I'm going to chain this over to that, make it a little easier to read, in my opinion. So this is going to post, going to send the body. Also, one thing, because I'm not going to be Ajax posting the validation token, I want to go ahead and remove that as well. So here you go. If we go ahead and we look at this and we refresh the page, you can see that we're now Ajax posting the values here. And like I said, if you had a problem with it, you're going to end up getting a bunch of null values, which means that C# couldn't automatically serialize the object that got passed to it. And then another thing too is we always want to JSON stringify our object because it's not going to be able to pass an actual JSON data object over the wire. So we want to say stringify, and then we're going to do that with our data. And then we also probably, as a good example here, want to set the headers here. So we're going to define a headers object. And the headers object here is going to have a few things. So it's going to have the accept parameter on it. And the accept is going to be application in JSON. And then we want the content type as well. And, you know, that should probably be, we're going to put this, because of the hyphen, that'll probably mess it up. So we're going to put this right inside of a string. As far as the key value pairs, obviously it's optional as far as the string, but then you can have certain values and everything that don't match up. So anyway, let's go ahead and post this value up now. Now that we have it looking the way we want. Now, one thing I also want to tell you guys is that the data objects, you can either have this capital or not capital. It doesn't actually matter. It's not case sensitive. So it's still going to bind up and serialize just fine. But I want to show you why this isn't going to work right now. And just because this is going to bite you in the future. And I know that it will. So hopefully you guys can remember. Now, when we go ahead and we request this page, let me make sure I have my breakpoint set here. I want to show you guys what's going on here. So if I refresh this page, I hit this post, and you're going to see that our band object is going to have a bunch of null values. And the reason why, you're probably like, why is that? So in order to fix that, we have to actually explicitly tell ASP.NET that we want to say from body. So we're saying you're going to get your data from the actual body that's passed in. And if you could see from the actual Ajax request that we're getting, you know, we're setting the body value here, which is just a JSON stringified data object. So after making that change, let's go ahead and restart the server. And now if we navigate over to the details page, you're going to see that we now have values that are being passed through. So that is how you Ajax post JSON data to your ASP.NET controller. So what I want to show you guys in this module here is that you can actually make your development a lot easier with .NET Core and ASP.NET with this new .NET watch command, which is very similar to like Webpack watch if you guys have ever used that before, but it listens for any sort of file changes that are being made. And that way you can go ahead and you just have to run it one time, and as you're making changes to the server code, you don't have to restart the application. It's going to go ahead and restart for you. So in order for this to actually work, you need to go to your NuGet, go to your tools and NuGet package manager, go to the manage NuGet packages, and here you can actually just type watch. So it's actually confusing because there's a few of them here, and this .NET watch is not actually what we want. So what I want you to do is type in watcher tools, and this should actually pull up the one that you want, which is Microsoft.NET watcher tools. And we want to go ahead and select that we're going to install it to our first application, and then just go ahead and click install. So basically, for the sake of this, we'll just make it easy. But if you go to the command prompt where the project is located here, and all you have to do is say .NET watch run. And then this will go through, and it's going to start up the server for you. So instead of the browser automatically opening up for you, you're going to want to go ahead and just pull up a browser. You can see it's listening on port 5000 there. So if we go over to the localhost, it's still going to run the same exact application. Go ahead and go to the localhost 5000. You can see that we get to this new music. And if we go over to our music details 1, here you can see the name of the band. We're getting, I know it's very hard to read here, but you can see we're getting the name Bayside here. Now this is coming from the server, so normally if I wanted to change that data, I'd have to restart the server. And if we look at the controller where the data is coming from, it's hard-coded right into the controller and passed down to the view. So if I want to change this, again, normally we would have to restart the server, but all I did was press Control S. And if we actually look at the code, you can actually see that it did watch, and it made a change here to our application. So without having to restart the server, if I just refresh the page, you're going to see that you have the actual changes. So it's much easier to go ahead and debug with this tool, or just to develop with this tool. It saves a lot of time. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. If you have, if you're looking for web development techniques, like some of the more modern stuff for 2019, I have this new course that you should check out on Udemy. There is a discount link in the description tab below. But this is going to cover literally everything that is being touched upon by most web developers when it comes to front end development. So JavaScript, the Sass, Webpack, Bootstrap, all that stuff. So it really covers everything in there. So make sure you guys check that out if you're interested in that. All right, so Materialize is a modern front-end framework that is actually based on Google's Material Design, which is very popular with things like React. And it's very mobile-friendly, responsive, everything like from the components, very flat look. But there's all these different components that you have that just work. And this is not a Bootstrap-based framework or anything. It doesn't use Bootstrap at all. So a lot of people kind of think that like all of these CSS frameworks are somehow built off of Bootstrap, and that's not the case. This is a completely separate project. It's very, very popular. It's built to use like Sass. So if you guys use CSS preprocessors, then this works very well with that. So to get started using it, it's really just as simple as going to your layout page, and you're just going to go ahead and for us to make this as easy as possible, I'm going to use the CDN and replace the jQuery right here. And these are just two CDNs. This is a content distribution network, which is really just a server. It's serving up the CSS and JavaScript that you need, and it's it's free to connect to, so it's just easier to set up that way. Now you also have the option of downloading the actual files and including them in your project, so you don't have to reach across the web to another server. And then there's also the option of having Sass compilation too. So if you have a Sass compiler, then you can download the actual Sass source files and start extending it. So after you've included Materialize, there are templates that you can use. Like if you go to this website here and you want to demo this template, you can take a look at this. And if you download it and just extract it to our www root folder or wherever your static folder is, then you can see that just as easily. We have a Materialize working UI here just that quickly. So what I want to show you in this video is, if you notice, if we went to our root directory where we installed this parallax template, everything works right and we have all our CSS. But what happens if we go to the details page and we go to our music details page and you look at this and we have no CSS, no images, everything's missing. Even though it's using the layout page, you can see it's using the layout because of the navigation bar and everything. So why is it? If we inspect the console, you're going to see anytime you have weirdness like this, you want to look at the console, you're going to see all these 404s not found. So it's not finding Materialize or all these external resources. And the reason why is because of this exact relative address here. So there is a shortcut though that we can use to solve this problem. And we do that by simply referencing the root directory of the project by using the tilde character. So if you use this tilde character, it's going to grab the root directory and then the /. So it's always going to work. So go ahead and update all your references so that they have this tilde /. So if we do that and we now go back over to the music directory or page, you can now see that we're getting the CSS and everything. And we inspect our console and we shouldn't be getting any more 404 error messages. Alright guys, so to date our application is actually just returning hard-coded data that is right into the controller, and that's not really what you see in a normal application. What we have here is the first application is considered a UI project. It's a web application. In multi-tier architecture, especially with large development corporations, there are different tiers. There's like database tiers, there's different middleware tiers and things like that. And then you have business logic and database logic, class libraries and things of that nature. So there's usually an abstraction layer that is between the UI and any sort of data that it's retrieving and sending to. And that's what we're going to look at here. So in order to make our application robust, we're going to want to go ahead and create a repository project inside of here that's going to be the abstraction between the project and our database. Now, typically this may even be in a separate project itself. So whether or not you want to do that or not, it's up to you. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to try to make it easy. Now what I want to do is go ahead and add a new item. And this is going to be an interface. So this is the first time we've seen this. But anytime you're coding in C#, you want to code to interfaces, which really means coding to abstractions, so that you can allow for dependency injection. And we'll see in a moment what I'm talking about there. Now, with C#, you typically want to name your interfaces. They start with an I to just differentiate it from the class. And in this case, we're just going to call this we'll just call this, yeah, we'll just call this band interface. And really, this is a bad name for it, so I actually want to rename this. We're going to call this band repository. And then what we're going to do is create a repository class. Let's go ahead and rename it. Now we're going to create a, and we want the interface to be public. All interfaces need to be public, otherwise they won't be able to be implemented from. And we're going to create a class that's actually going to use this interface. And this class is going to be called just band repository. And now band repository is going to implement the interface of iband repository, and it's going to do so that way. Now, if iband repository had some methods on it, which we don't currently have, then you would get an error message. But let's go ahead and add a few public methods on this band repository that we expect any object that is going to inherit from iband repository to implement. Let's go ahead and create the first one, which is going to return all bands. So since this is more of like an API type of thing, we want to have, we'll just have like a method called, we'll just say get bands, I guess. And this should probably be capitalized as well. So we'll say get bands is the name of our function. And it's going to take no arguments, so we just need to open and close parenthesis after this. And then you also need to declare what type of value it's going to return, right? Because of C# and its statically typed nature. So we're going to say that this is going to return a list of band objects. And now we need to obviously reference our model's bands, and that's what we're gonna do here. And then we just need a semicolon here. So what we've done now is we've said that any class that's going to implement the iband repository has to have a public method on it called getBands that's going to return a list of band objects. And then while we're at it, we're going to also have a band method that's just going to say it's going to say getBand, but you're going to pass in an int ID, and it's going to return a band object. So now we have these two public methods. It's probably a good idea to go ahead and document them. So if you do 3 / in a row, it's going to automatically give you this summary context, and we can just say here gets all bands in the database, and then it returns a list of bands. So that's how you give documentation. I'm not going to do that for the other one, but I just want to show you guys that actually gives you type hinting when you're looking at your code later on. You can say, oh, get bands, what is this all about? And you can see gets all bands and the database, which is kind of self-explanatory, but still certain methods are more complicated than others, and that documentation becomes a little bit more crucial. So after we've done that, if we go back over to the band repository, you now see that we're getting the error message because it's saying you haven't fulfilled the contract. So when we click on it, you can do this. You can say implement interface, and it's going to automatically create the methods that you need in order to satisfy the contract. And here you can see that we're not really doing anything. But what I want to do is take the music controller information, and where we had, yeah, I thought we had a list of bands somewhere, but we don't. Yeah, we don't. All right, okay, anyway. So let me go back here. I'm just going to say, so for get bands, I'm going to throw together a new list of bands. So we'll say var list of bands equals new list of band objects. And then we can go ahead and start instantiating new band objects in here. This needs to say new. Actually, no variable name here. Sorry, I copied and pasted from the controller. So that's a little confusing here. No semicolon. All right, so hopefully that all makes sense for you. There we go. All right. Okay, and now we can just go ahead and just comma delimit and have a few more band objects inside of here. So I just want to have 3. All right, so those are just 3 different random things. I don't know why, but All right, so now you can see it's complaining because it's like, oh, we haven't returned our list of bands, so we want to go ahead and just return that. And now we've satisfied this particular method of our repository. All right, so now what we're going to do is go back over to our music controller. If we go to the index method, which is the main music endpoint, and we go and right click and say go to view, you're going to remember that we did do a for each in here. So we're expecting to get a list of band objects that we can then iterate over. So what we want to do here is we actually want to call out to our repository. So we can actually go ahead and instantiate a repository right now. And we'll say repository equals new band repository. And this will give an error message because we have to actually import it. So it should give you the option to go ahead and import that. So using first application repository, now we get this this message here, and we can go ahead and call it in our view. We can say repository dot get bands, and we have to call it as a function. And then now let's go ahead and go back to our music page. And if we remove the details portion and we go to the music, you can now see that we're getting the values back from our list, and it's coming from a repository, which is a class that implements an interface. And in the next video, we'll see a little bit more about how to implement dependency injection to our controller, or actually more like using inversion of control. All right, thanks guys. So .NET Core has built-in support for dependency injection, and we created a repository in our last video, and the repository is using an interface, and all that is great. It's coding to abstractions. However, it's actually implementing a concrete object from our repository. It's actually instantiating it right here. That's usually not what you want. That's actually a bad idea. So what we actually want is we want to be able to inject the repository into the controller. That way when we're unit testing it later, we can actually inject a mocked repository that is returning mock data for our unit tests without having to rely on any sort of external service. So how do we do that? We add a constructor method, but before we do that, we're going to go ahead and create a private variable. Now typically with repositories or any sort of private variables, a lot of people will say that it's a convention to have it start with a lowercase, but it can be whatever you want. But we're going to want this to be a read-only object, and we're going to say that it's a band repository object, and then we'll just call it band repository. So we're declaring it up here at the top. So that means our class is going to be using it, and we can use it throughout all the methods on our class object. So how do we go ahead and instantiate the value though? We want to instantiate it from the value that's passed in. So we're going to go ahead and create a public constructor method, which is really just a public method that has the same name as the controller. So it's called music controller, and this is automatically going to be a constructor method. It's going to know to handle it that way, and we're going to take in a band repository object. So we're going to say repository, and then from inside of here, this is where we're going to go ahead and instantiate our private band repository equals repository that got passed in. So now what we can do, anytime this constructor or this controller is instantiated, we can now inject a dynamic repository into that controller. And our code is now using inversion of control, which allows us to use dependency injection. So we're injecting our dependencies into the code. By the way that we wrote this, we're able to do that, as opposed to if you didn't write it this way, you wouldn't be able to do it, and unit testing and everything else becomes much more difficult. Another good thing about this is because we're using an IBAN repository, any sort of class that implements the IBAN repository would actually satisfy the requirement for this controller. So you could literally plug in and plug out all kinds of different repositories for different environments, different test code, things like that. So it's just a very clean way of writing your code. So now what I want to do is I want to go ahead and get rid of the repository that I'm using here, and I'm going to go ahead and reference my local band repository and say get bands, and it's going to work the exact same way. Now the thing is that this isn't going to work by default, because what we need to do is we actually need to we have to register this new service so that we know how so that the MVC.NET application knows how to inject this appropriately. So in order to register this service, we just have to go over to our startup class, and inside of here we're going to go ahead and add the services, and We could say services, and then there's a few options here. You could say add transient, which means that it's going to be created once for every request, and that's for lightweight services. There's add singleton, and that's what we're going to use here. And the add singleton, it takes in arguments here, so you're going to want to pass in the types that it's expecting. So if you remember, we have a band repository, right? I need to go ahead and spell that right, and then we're going to have to bring that in, and we're also going to say what you're going to be returning to me as a band repository. So that's what you're going to be injecting. So let's go ahead and make sure we're including the correct models here, and then we also need to instantiate this object. So if everything goes correctly, this should use the iBand repository to stamp out a band repository class object. It should then pass it into the controller that it finds that matches up to this band iBand repository. And by doing so, the only controller that does so is the music controller here that has the constructor method that takes an iBand repository. So by default, MVC.net is going to know to inject that object into this, and then it's going to be assigned to the local repository value, which is safely cordoned off from everything else because it's a private variable on this class object. And then we can start then referencing that private value then to request the public methods on a repository. So hopefully that's not all too confusing for you, but it's just ultimately calling this, and it's a very roundabout way of doing so, but it allows us to unit test much easier, and we'll see in the future. It also allows us once again to stamp out different services. And just to show you guys that it does work, if I'm going to highlight that entire line up here at the top, I'm going to comment out those that line. I just want to show you that if we try to request the page the way we did before for all the bands, we're going to get an error message. And we're getting a 500 server error, and it's saying that we are unable to service type iBand repository. It's like, we don't know what you're talking about. It looks like you're trying to register some sort of service. We're expecting some sort of value to be declared in the services configuration section of the startup file, and it's not there. So it's complaining about that, and that's ultimately kind of a cryptic way of saying you need to register the service so that we know how to resolve it. And once again, you add this back, and I refresh the page. We now have the same exact result, but we're using dependency injection through inversion of control and a very clean design pattern. All right, guys, thanks for watching. All right, now let's go ahead and look at how we can add a unit testing project to our application. I'm going to go ahead and add a completely separate application from our first application. So I'm going to right click on the solution, and from here I'm going to go ahead and say add a new project. This is going to pull up my little explorer here, and I can go ahead and choose a bunch of different things. I want to go down to test, and you can see unit test project for the .NET framework. And we can just call this unit test project 1. I don't really care about that. You're going to see here that it's using the framework here. You can choose the different frameworks, and unfortunately with this particular thing, it only works with the .NET framework. So to confuse things, you have to actually click on .NET Core, and then from here you can go ahead and select your unit test project. So we're going to use the MS test project for .NET Core, and select OK. And then from here, what we need to do is we actually need to add a reference. So to have our unit testing project be able to reference our actual project so that we can test the code in our project, we need to go ahead and add a reference to our unit test project. So with our unit test project here, go ahead and on the dependencies, or you can just right click and say add reference down here. And then from here, under the projects, you might have it under browse, but you want to select projects, and you can just click your first application. So that way the unit test can now reference the first application. And why do we want to do that? Well, it's because we want to go ahead and write a test method here. So this is going to be our test method. And for now, let's just, instead of having to change the name, in fact, let's go ahead and change the name because I want to give you guys proper naming convention. But you want to say what it is that you're testing and what you expect the outcome to be. So we're just going to say, we just want, controller does not return null or something like that. So like this, now we would go ahead and under our test, we would go ahead and instantiate our controller. So we'll say controller equals new, and then from here we can go ahead and instantiate the actual controller that we're trying to call, which if you remember correctly, we have a music controller. And now because I've done this, you're going to see that we want to add a reference. So because we add the reference to our unit test project, we can now reference the project. And now that we brought that in, you can see that we haven't satisfied the requirement from the controller. So if you guys have followed along from the tutorial all the way up till now, you know that you have to inject an object here, a band repository object that the controller is then going to use to test. And from here, this is where it becomes very beneficial, because then you could end up mocking your repository object to satisfy the requirement. So I could say repository equals new band repository. All right, and after I've instantiated that object, I need to go ahead and bring that reference in as well. And then from the music controller, I'm going to go ahead and pass in my repository. And now that we brought that in, we want to go ahead and just say assert, which is a built-in keyword. And we're going to say is not null. And then we'll pass in the controller. So this will return true or false. So if it's not null, it'll return true and our test will pass. And if it's null, then it's going to return false and the test will fail. And we can go ahead and rename our unit test as well. It's called unit test 1. It's actually a terrible name, but you know what? I'm not going to do that right now. If you want to run the test method, just right click on the actual test method portion and say run test. And this is going to go through, it's going to test, and hopefully you'll get a green check mark if it passes or a red X if it fails. All right, so it does take a second to compile because everything has to compile from the test project to the actual UI project. So if you're like me and you see this message here that it can't find view features, what you want to do is go to your NuGet package manager. And from here you can install the view features here. So by selecting this, go ahead and add it for your unit test project and select install. So now if we go back to our test method and we run it, it's going to be able to run and it's going to pass. And like I said, you should be able to see a green check mark here, but I guess maybe that's only ReSharper that does that. But anyway, you can see that the test method here is that you get the green check mark. So this is your test explorer. If you guys don't see that, you can go up to your tools or next to your tools and go to test, and under Windows, the test explorer. But that's how you set up unit testing in .NET Core. So in this video, I want to show you guys how to mock your repository object using a much better method than actually stamping out an actual concrete implementation. So this is a concrete object that was stamped out from this class. And this class may have dependencies on other classes, networks, things like that. And a lot of the times you need to have this be a mocked object because it's much too difficult to instantiate it just to test something that uses it. So in order to get around that problem, we want to use a library called MOQ, which is short for mock. I guess it's like a cute way of saying it. Go to your NuGet package manager, manage packages, go to our browse, and here we're going to say MOQ. And MOQ here, you can go ahead and download that. You can say we want to add it to our unit test project because that's where we're going to be using it. And then once this is installed, you have to accept. We can then go ahead and start using it. So this will add a reference to your project. So what I can do in order to use this new library is I want to go ahead and create a mock repository. So I'm going to say a variable mock repository equals new MOQ. And then inside of here, I need to say what it is that I'm trying to mock. So I'm going to say iband repository. And I'm going to instantiate this new object. Now you're going to see from here that we have a reference missing. So we need to say using MOQ. That's going to resolve that problem. And now that we have this mock repository object, I can actually start setting up what it actually does. So I could say, you know what, when you say get all bands, I want you to return some sort of custom thing. So I could say mock repository.setup. This should be, and then we're going to do a lambda function, and then we're going to say x.getBands .returns, and this should be capitals, and then we're going to say new list of I say new list. I don't know why it keeps doing that. Don't do that. All right, so new list, you press escape to make it not do that, and then from here I'm going to say band. Right, and because remember, this returns a list of bands. So what you need to do is, in order to use a list, you have to import generics. So that's what it's going to ask you to do. The x.getBands, and this should be a function, and it returns new list of band. And this needs to be, we need to reference our band. So using our model, there we go. So now this new list of band, I can actually go ahead and instead of using the concrete repository, I can go ahead and pass in the mock repository. And because this is using the mock repository, Oh, and that's another thing too. Since it's using the mock object, you need to say mock repository dot object, and that's going to be the actual mocked object that MOQ made for you. I don't know why that's like that. No semicolon, maybe. Yeah. Okay. All right. There we go. So this is returning this new list of bands. So much like the other way, if we just ran the test right now, you can see that this will actually pass. And it's because the controller is not null. Now, as far as this list and this value that's getting returned, the reason why this MOQ is so important is because you can go ahead and inside of here, I could start instantiating new band objects and just start saying, you know, title equals this is completely mocked. And your controller and everything is going to work exactly the same way because of the way that we set it up using inversion of control. Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back. So in this video, what we want to do is look at validation. And we had a create form page that was collecting some information for the band. And if you remember, we put in this validation message for, and I didn't really cover that too much, but in this video, that's what I want to cover. So the preferred method with .NET Core is actually still to use jQuery for its validation. And it really does help you a lot, and you'll see here in the video why. But a lot of people are turned off from jQuery and they don't want to use it. And you don't really have to, but then you're going to be custom rolling your own validation. I'm sure there's validation libraries out there, but let me just show you how easy it is to actually use jQuery and validate the way most every place I've ever seen that uses .NET does it. So let's use the required attribute, and this required attribute we can give a custom error message into it. So we can say error message equals. And we can just say, what is this field? It's the genre. Well, so we'll say genre is required or something like that. So now that we've added this attribute, this is called a data annotation. And automatically, because we've set up our create page to have this validation message for the genre, if we enable client-side validation by including just a couple of scripts that we need to our layout page, we can go ahead and get client-side validation without having to do any work. So if you paste in, there's a CDN that I want to point to. And the client-side scripts right here, if you just pause the screen, are these two validate and jQuery validate libraries that we need. So now that we have those client scripts enabled, if we go to try to submit our page, the client-side validation is automatically going to kick in. It's going to look at that required attribute, and it's going to see that there's no value in the genre field here. You can see, like, I know the UI is all messed up, but you can see we can have a value here. And if there's no value, it's going to go ahead and throw an error message. So you can see automatically genre is required. It didn't even try to hit the server. So all that code is set up for you right there. Now, normally you would want, like, some sort of style on this. So, like, you would end up having like the genre error. Really, you could just have a general error message, probably error class that you can assign. You'll see in a moment I can actually show you how to assign a class to this. But if we do this, like normally you would want to have like the color be red, because that's more in line with like an error message. But we'll actually see in the future videos actually how we apply custom attributes, because that's actually a completely separate video. Now, there's all kinds of other data annotations that we can use for validation. Tons of freedom there. So let's go ahead and look at a few of them. The regular expression validation is something that you're going to see a lot, and we're going to do that right now. And to do that, you just simply say regular expression. And then the first argument to it, you should do a string, an escape string. So that way it's basically a raw string format. And then you're going to use whatever sort of whatever sort of validation you want. So in this case, this is a regular expression that says that there must be like some sort of number, which is one, like, it's funny, like, say, why is it like D? Like, what does that stand for? But anyway, for what, I guess digit or something. But anyway, like, for whatever reason, that is the regular expression for the number. So this will say, like, so basically if there's not a number in the origin, you're going to throw an error message. And again, you have the option of saying what that error message is. So you can pass that in and say, you stupid mother. I'm just kidding. So let's just keep it at that one. And when we go ahead and try to validate this, let's go ahead and see if it works. So once again, hopefully you guys have the watch. Make sure you guys watch my video about how to set up a watch, because it's so much easier than having to restart your server all the time. So if we go back over to the web page now, I'm just going to zoom really far in on the origin. And we didn't make it required, by the way. So if you try to go ahead and submit, it's probably only going to fire for the genre, obviously, because that was the only one that we said was required. But once you go ahead and put something in the origin field, this input is so bad. I should put some CSS on this. But anyway, once you put a value in here, our regular expression said actually one number. So you can't have two because then it's going to fire the validation. If you have one number, the validation goes away. That's how you use the regular expression validator. Regular expressions are like there's entire books written on the subject. It's something I've been using for like 8 years, but it is very, very cryptic. You can never really read them. Like you can write them pretty well, but then you never really know how to read them if they're really, really complex. And you just kind of have to rely on some. But some are like literally like almost like pages long, and people just assume that they work because nobody has time to actually break down what the hell they're actually doing. Hey guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at server-side validation. So in the last one, we looked at client-side validation. And in the same way that these data annotations worked on the client, they're going to work the same way on the back end. And by back end, I don't mean anything inappropriate. I'm talking about the back end server. So the server-side code, the C# that's running on the IIS web server or the Kestrel web server if you're on on Linux or Mac. But if you're on Windows, you could run this on IIS, and that's the default Windows web server that's been around for a very long time. But our backend server-side code can actually validate in a very similar way. So let's go ahead and look at our controller for the music controller. And we're going to go ahead and we're posting the data to the controller. So I'm going to go ahead and post to this endpoint here, and you can see that we have this from form attribute on there. Now this is different from the earlier videos that had the from body, and the from body is actually what is getting the body content from an Ajax JSON post. So like you send JSON data on the body. It can be XML or something else, but either way, you need to say from form if you're getting it from form elements. So we'll run the app from Visual Studio so that we can hit this breakpoint, and we'll put the breakpoint right here on the try statement, and make sure it's on the curly brace so that way it actually gets hit, because if it fails before, you obviously won't get to that return statement. So here we have the form, and I'm going to go ahead and just post some valid values here so that we can satisfy the requirements, and we'll post all these values to the form. And if everything went well, oh, we're not running the app. I'm sorry. You need to make sure you're running the app from Visual Studio. That's something you're probably going to do. With the watch, it's great. You can run it from the console, but like with Visual Studio, you get the actual debugging, and that's really one of the benefits of using Visual Studio in C#. So unfortunately for people on the command line, like you don't have that option. But anyway, let's go ahead and post this. Hopefully there is I'm sure there's some sort of, we have to actually send a number. I'm sure that there is some sort of way of actually getting proper debugging on the command line just using .NET Core, like on Linux or Mac, but I'm not actually 100% sure. So unfortunately, I don't know about that. But with Visual Studio, we do get this debugging, and we can actually see the values that are being posted here. And what we're going to want to do here is on the server side, we can actually validate these values. Because on the client, you know, obviously a malicious user they can like bypass the JavaScript that is validating your data, and they can send bogus data to your server, and your server wouldn't know any better if it doesn't actually check to make sure that whatever you checked for on the client side should also be checked for on the server side. So that's what we're going to do now. So in order to validate, all we have to do is we can say there's this special keyword. If we can say if, and then we say capital like M for model state is valid, then we could just we'll just console log something, console write line. And really, it's not like any sort of special built-in method. With C#, it's all about there's static classes, there's abstract classes, there's interfaces, there's extension methods, and knowing all the difference and trying to explain that is much too difficult for a beginner course. So I'm just glossing over that. So if we fire up the server and we go ahead and we put a breakpoint on here, I'm going to go ahead and submit the form, and I should get this model state is valid. And if it's true, then it means that everything past server side that you also set for client-side validation. using the annotations that we set on our band class right here. So that means if I post these valid values here, I'm going to hit the server, and you're going to see that I post all those valid values. It matched all the client-side validation. That's why it was even allowed to hit the server. And when it got here, it also did the server-side validation, and it checked for everything, and it said if model state is valid and it's true. And this is, like I said, this is a little bit more complex, but you can think of this as somewhat, kind of built-in magic, but you kind of have to just get used to it with .NET, and you can learn more about how it actually is working under the covers. But model state is valid is attached to the data annotations that are being used on your model class, and that is being set here. So there's a lot of magic under the hood. It's very similar to kind of like Ruby on Rails type of thing, but you eventually get used to it, and you just start using the shortcuts, and you just realize, hey, I don't really have to understand all of how that all works, but I just have to know how to use it. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe. If you have, if you're looking for web development techniques, like some of the more modern stuff for 2019, I have this new course that you should check out on Udemy. There is a discount link in the description tab below, but this is going to cover literally everything that is being touched upon by most web developers when it comes to, front-end development. So JavaScript, the Sass, Webpack, Bootstrap, all that stuff. So it really covers everything in there. So make sure you guys check that out if you're interested in that.